Now, in a change to our schedule, Eleanor Goodman looks back at the career of Lady Thatcher and reviews her life after she left Downing Street in What Thatcher Did Next.
We're leaving Downing Street for the last time after 11 and a half wonderful years. Now it's time for a new chapter to open, and I wish John Major all the luck in the world.
It was not a new chapter she was ever to enjoy. Margaret Thatcher was in enforced retirement for twice as long as she was in power. For the first few years, she railed against what she saw as the treachery of her colleagues and vented her frustration with the direction of Conservative policy, particularly on Europe. And even after she had to withdraw from public life, her legacy cast a shadow over her successors. All future Prime Ministers, Labour as well as Tory, have been defined in relation to her and courted her, if only for a photo call. This programme looks at her life after she left office, how she continued trying to be a political force, and how her conduct affected her own legacy and the Conservative Party. In the short term, she tried to stem her grief by keeping frantically busy, packing up her own clothes in mobile wardrobes and lobbying on behalf of her chosen successor, John Major. Cecil Parkinson, formerly her party chairman and one of the few who advised her to fight on, says John Major owed her his job.
I don't think without her support John Major would have become Prime Minister. She delivered office to him.
That was part of the trouble for the Conservative Party in the years to come. She saw John Major as her protégé, but when he didn't turn out to be a true Thatcherite, she felt another burning sense of betrayal. That exacerbated the grievance she felt about the way she was deposed. For in losing the job, she not only lost her power and status, but also the framework of her existence. When asked on leaving Downing Street what she was going to do next, she said, "Work. That's all we have ever known." Alistair McAlpine, now Lord McAlpine, was one of the inner circle of friends who knew her best and saw her struggling to fill the vacuum.
When you lose a job like that, it's very similar to having a bereavement, and you do feel it's a great loose end, and it does have an effect on you. It was very sad, and of course a lot of her close friends were very bitter about this. It affected their thinking for years to come.
Her PR man, Tim Bell, now also in the House of Lords, was another of those who she'd always been able to relax with, even though when relaxing the talk had tended to be politics.
It was a very difficult period of time. I can remember it particularly because one of the big issues was Christmas. We had always spent Christmas Day at Chequers. There was a group of us that were always invited. And Alistair tried to recreate that the Christmas after she'd resigned. And we had a Christmas Day celebration at the Dorchester, and it was just a disaster. Hadn't got things to talk about. We weren't running the country anymore. We weren't discussing those kind of issues. We were just, going through a sort of make-believe, which didn't work because we weren't in Chequers.
She didn't plan to retire, but under any circumstances there is no job specification for ex-prime ministers, particularly a fit and energetic one. She was such a controversial figure, internationally as well as at home, there was no way she could be given some consensus-building job on the world stage. But nor could she cease working, as testified by Charles Pole, who was her private secretary in Downing Street.
She really existed to work. One could perhaps rephrase Descartes and say, I work, therefore I am. I mean, her whole life was work. Now, of course, some of her energy went into starting on her memoirs. Some of it went into speeches and international visits. But she couldn't keep quiet. It was quite unnatural. And one has to say that she had a right to be heard. People criticise her for speaking up and sometimes contradicting the government of the day. But she hadn't been defeated in an election. No, she had been shoved unceremoniously out of office by her immediate parliamentary colleagues. And the last thing in the world she was ever going to do was to shut up.
And that was the problem for John Major. The party had been deeply unpopular when Mrs. Thatcher resigned and got a boost in the polls when he took over. But she never recognised that winning another election might require a change of tone and, in some cases, policies. As his government limped from one crisis to another, her acolytes felt they had her support to undermine him. Ironically, though, his first difficulty was that she was too supportive of him, promising to be a good backseat driver. Tim Bell insists she meant well.
She had made that famous comment about being a backseat driver at Central Office when she left. She meant it completely sincerely. She couldn't understand why her successors saw her as such a threat. She thought they ought to have seen her as a helpful influence.
That wasn't how John Major saw it, as his cabinet colleague Ken Clarke recalls.
We had that dreadful period at first when she publicly announced that she wanted to be a backseat driver, which not surprisingly greatly annoyed John Major. This was the sad period of her life. I mean, she was a great Prime Minister who unfortunately did not reconcile herself to the fact that she had lost office. The result was she became politically very active, as she was constantly trying to influence things, and she rather surrounded herself with an entourage of advisers who persuaded her falsely that she'd been the victim of some sort of plot, that she was being betrayed by John Major. It was a very sad aftermath, really, of a great premiership.
Charles Pulse stayed on in Downing Street for the first 9 months of Major's premiership to ensure continuity at a time when British troops were going into action in the First Gulf War. He also acted as a bridge between Margaret Thatcher and the world, from which she was now excluded.
It was sensible to keep her posted, otherwise she might lash out with some ill-judged remark or criticism, not particularly because she wanted to do any damage, but in a very delicate situation one had to be careful.
Because she was such a dominant figure, the media hung on her every word, and she still set the parameters of debate within the Conservative Party. At times it must have seemed as if she was a ghost at the cabinet table. Not exactly, says Douglas Hurd, who was Foreign Secretary in John Major's government.
Margaret Thatcher wasn't a ghost at the cabinet table. She was a voice on the telephone. Can I come and see you, Douglas? And of course she could come and see you. And several times as Foreign Secretary, one became exposed to it. I mean, she was acting entirely within her rights. I was never conscious of any sort of intriguing. I was conscious of outright assault.
She was supportive of John Major during the Gulf War, but as he tried to nudge the party towards his version of compassionate conservatism, she became increasingly suspicious that he was trying to undermine her achievements. Cecil Parkinson.
He just wasn't, in her words, one of us. So I think she gradually became disillusioned with John, but it was in part her fault, because she thought he was almost a male version of her, had her ideas, and he clearly didn't. He was his own person.
At first, she did try to keep her opinions to herself at home, though they often seeped out, initially from interviews she gave in America. Tim Bell.
As far as she was concerned, America was a foreign country. It would take some months for the news to get back to London. That was how her instincts were. And when you're overseas, you can say things that you can't say when you're at home, that in some way that's not as offensive.
In a series of American interviews, she went on the record with her view that John Major was dismantling her inheritance. She dismissed his government as the B team. This, despite claiming to be loyal.
I must say that the press sometimes excel themselves. I've been very quiet at home, which has been a very great effort. So they've taken to interpreting my silence.
But there were some things, she told her audience, that were too important to keep quiet about, most notably Europe.
So I think that these decisions that have to be made in Europe are of enormous moment to the British people, the whole future of our Parliament, and the more openly that we discuss them and the more thoroughly we discuss them, the better. So I think perhaps a little less silence might be called for on my part.
Europe was the issue that had helped precipitate her fall from office and which would split the Conservatives for years to come. As she saw it, it was her duty to put Britain's national interest before party unity or loyalty to a successor who she felt was caving in to the integrationists. Tim Bell again.
She saw Europe as a serious threat to the independence of Britain. Given how strongly she felt about it, I would have found it amazing if she had swallowed her views and never said them. She felt very, very strongly about it. She really saw Britain's identity being lost in Europe.
Viewed from inside John Major's bunker, this was deeply disloyal. Norman Fowler was a long-standing cabinet ally of John Major.
The fact that she'd been ejected from the leadership had a profound effect. It was an enormous shock to her. And in a way, I think that the way that she made sense of this was to fight back on the European issue. But in doing that, of course, she helped to destroy the premiership of John Major, and John Major was the person that she had actually done more than anyone to create as Prime Minister.
In 1992, John Major defied the odds and the critics within his own party by getting re-elected as Prime Minister. But immediately afterwards, Baroness Thatcher, as she then became, let rip over Europe. The woman who had signed the Single European Act in 1985 pledged herself to oppose the Maastricht Treaty signed by Major just before the election.
I must say, my lords, I personally could never have signed this treaty. I hope that that is clear to all who have heard me.
The Maastricht Treaty, which extended the scope and ambitions of the European Union, became the bone over which the Conservative Party tore itself apart. John Major, with a majority of only 21, felt himself under constant attack. In his memoirs, he says that though they managed to exchange words in public for form's sake, no holes were barred on her side. Kenneth Baker, who served both Prime Ministers, remembers the poisonous atmosphere.
The Tory party was very disunited. Margaret became more and more disenchanted with John Major. He also became disenchanted with her. He got to the stage where he couldn't stand her.
For John Major, her worst offence as a former party leader was to actively encourage rebellion over such a fundamental piece of the government's programme as the Maastricht Treaty. For the Eurosceptic rebels, though, these were heady days. She would come and address the rebels at their so-called Maastricht pie parties near Westminster, where suitably English food was served. Bill Cash was one of those MPs enjoying themselves.
So there was a tremendous air of excitement because everybody knew that it was, in fact, an act of defiance. Immediately next to Westminster, she would speak, not for very long, then we'd get down to tucking into this extremely good steak and kidney pie.
At the time of the key vote on Maastricht, tales were legion about how waverers were taken down the corridor to the Lords to have their spines stiffened by her.
Insofar as there is a myth that's developed, I think generated by her political enemies, that somehow or other she was in a state of perpetual insurrection and was engaged in setting up meetings to undermine the government and the Prime Minister. I would say that was just simply not true.
Bill Cash's view, but that wasn't the way Kenneth Clarke saw it.
She was actively urging people to vote against it, come what may. Didn't seem to mind if it brought the government down. What, of course, we were doing all the time was calculating how to redress this, trying to work out how many people she persuaded to go into the lobbies with the Labour Party that we might otherwise rescue.
Her behaviour brought inevitable comparisons with the way her predecessor, Ted Heath, had behaved. From their different perspectives as a Major ally and a Thatcher loyalist, the two Kens, Clarke and Baker, see things differently.
When Margaret was in office, Ted just remained icily aloof, utterly but silently detached. He never went so far as to try to campaign against her. And to have one of your predecessors actively campaigning against you made it very, very difficult for John Major ever to assert any proper authority over the party.
She was never as disloyal to John as Heath was to her. Heath went into a long, prolonged sulk and would brief the press against her. Margaret, I don't think, ever briefed the press against John Major, but she made it clear in her strange way, and a rather effective way, that he was less of a favourite.
She didn't need to brief the press herself. Her acolytes gave poisonous briefings reflecting her views. With a grey Prime Minister in office, her opinions were still big news, particularly in the Eurosceptic papers. Her critics say the further she got from Downing Street, the more she abandoned the pragmatism she'd had to adopt in office, and the more ideological she became. In this way, she developed her own version of history, distilled in her memoirs, which she publicised in interviews.
I was turned out because I said to Europe, no, no, no. That no, no, no is turned into yes, yes.
She also criticised John Major's decision to withdraw the Conservative whip from rebel Eurosceptic MPs, comparing him to an overpowering headmaster. More broadly, she accused him of not being conservative enough, He had deliberately dismantled a part of her legacy, the poll tax, for example, but privately he fumed against her disloyalty, reportedly calling her mad and loopy. He later wrote in his own memoirs that Thatcher's support for the Maastricht rebels had turned a difficult task into an impossible one. But Alistair McAlpine defends her right to speak out.
You can't go through life telling people not to say things they believe. You can't, I can't, John Major couldn't.
Dennis Thatcher was so angry about the way he felt the party tried to gag his wife that he used a speech in the constituency of Margaret Thatcher's former parliamentary private secretary, Archie Hamilton, to claim she was the one person in the world not to have freedom of speech.
He came to give a wonderful speech to my constituents, and he did seem to feel that she was being rather victimised by people telling her that she couldn't say what she wanted to say. And I think he felt quite hurt by the way that people were getting at her, and that's what made him say that he really did feel that she was the one person in Britain who didn't seem to have free speech and was not allowed to say anything. I would argue that he wasn't necessarily right there. I think you are under enormous constraints as a former Prime Minister, and you've really got to recognise that your successor has a very difficult job, whatever happens.
Partly to get away from the accusations of disloyalty, and partly to provide a framework for her life, she embarked on a frantic programme of speaking engagements abroad. There she often got the kind of adulation she used to get from the Conservative Party. As well as travelling abroad, she increasingly turned her attention to international affairs. In 1993, as Yugoslavia fell apart in an increasingly bloody civil war, she took up the cause of the Bosnian Muslims, favouring strong intervention to protect them from the Serbs. In private, she was said to have accused Douglas Hurd, the Foreign Secretary, of being an appeaser like Neville Chamberlain. Publicly, she was only slightly more restrained.
It'll give encouragement to every dictator, every would-be dictator, that the West has not the will to stand up for the innocent. The West will betray the innocent. What a terrible thing.
She had a completely one-sided view of it. She didn't accept any complications. It was a simple matter of the Serbs were doing wicked things and they must be stopped by force.
Although Hurd was not impressed, her view did carry weight where it mattered, according to Charles Pole.
I think she had more influence on American opinion, probably on this particular issue, than on British opinion. And I think probably it got through in the end to President Clinton that the only way to bring this situation to a head was to use force. And when the bombing started, of course, the Serbs caved pretty rapidly.
It was America which provided her with her favourite platform. There she felt politically at home with free market Republicans. Charles Pole again.
Going to America after she was no longer Prime Minister was a great solace to Mrs. Thatcher because she still got the adulation that she obviously enjoyed, the large crowds, the fervent support, and giving a speech there evoked a reaction from the audience of enthusiasm and support, which she would not get in the United Kingdom.
In 1991, she was awarded the US Presidential Medal of Freedom by President Bush Sr. in recognition of her support for America during the Gulf crisis. He recalled this in terms that would have been familiar to her cabinet colleagues.
And she listened to my explanation, agreed with the decision, but then added these words of caution, words that guided me through the Gulf crisis, words I'll never forget as long as I'm alive. Remember, George, she said, this is no time to go wobbly. Well,
and thank you, Mr. President, for the wonderful things you said, including that wobbly bit.
One reason she went so often to the States was to raise money for the Thatcher Foundation. She had started this shortly after leaving Downing Street to propagate her ideas, particularly in the emerging democracies of Eastern Europe. After an initial flurry of activity, it didn't make the impact she might have hoped, but it did help bring on a generation of politicians who understood capitalism. Her other big project, of course, was her autobiography, published in 2 parts in 1993 and 95, which she had originally wanted to call Undefeated. Every Prime Minister wants to put their version of history on the record, but inevitably publication caused more problems for John Major. In 1997, to neither his surprise nor hers, he lost the election to Tony Blair. Lady Thatcher was initially all geared up to support John Redwood as a true free-market Thatcherite, as Major's replacement as party leader. But then she heard that Redwood was making a compact with the Europhile incarnate Ken Clarke. Cecil Parkinson recalls her reaction.
She couldn't believe that John Redwood would do that. I spoke to her that morning. She said, no, John would never go into partnership with Ken. At 11 o'clock that morning it was announced that he hadn't. At 12 o'clock she was on the steps of the House of Commons with William Hague saying, he's my man.
I am supporting William Hague. Now, have you got the name? William Hague. Vote for William Hague, for principled government, following the same kind of government which I led, and vote for him on Thursday.
When William Hague himself was replaced as leader in 2001, she again intervened in the leadership contest, backing the Eurosceptic Ian Duncan Smith. But her influence at Westminster was waning outside the hard core of her Eurosceptic supporters. What she still had, though, was the power to embarrass her successors. The annual conferences were a nightmare for the party managers. Before the 2001 election, in an attempt to be helpful, she described her appearance at the conference as The Mummy Returns, unaware it was the title of a horror film. But her health, once so vigorous she could work all night, was beginning to fade. As early as 2000, her daughter Carol said her mother was getting uncharacteristically confused. Some friends, like her advertising guru Maurice Saatchi, are upset by this characterisation of her mental state.
She was tired, weak, and certainly she would find it hard to sustain a long conversation, but not because her mind wasn't able to comprehend what was going on, but because she was tired.
In 2002, she reluctantly agreed to her doctor's advice to stop speaking in public after she'd had a stroke. A biography, shortly to be published by her former advisor Robin Harris, claimed there were arguments with her husband Dennis, who found her failing memory and repetitiveness difficult to deal with. But when he died in 2003, she was bereft. A small band of friends, like Lord Bell, rallied round, knowing the void he left in her life.
Dennis was completely in Margaret's life, and Margaret required Dennis to be there to discuss all decisions, all promotions, all sackings. All of those things were always discussed with Dennis. Whether she followed Dennis's view or not is an altogether different argument. She experienced a massive loss when Dennis died. He had been part of her life forever. She was very lonely. She couldn't really come to terms with it. It took some time for her to remember that he was dead. She would forget all the time. And I think it was a bigger loss to her than almost anything else.
She also had to suffer her son Mark being arrested in South Africa for suspected involvement in an attempted coup in Equatorial Guinea. He was subsequently released, but his marriage failed and she rarely saw the grandchildren who lived abroad. Mark had always been her favourite, but to the surprise of her friends, she was much cheered by her daughter Carol's successful appearance on the TV show I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here. Tim Bell again.
When Carol did Somebody Get Me Out of Here, we all thought that she wouldn't have the faintest idea what was going on. She absolutely watched the programme. She was fascinated by it. She thought Carol did a fantastic job. And she was thrilled when she won and said, typical Thatcher. Typical Thatcher, she's won.
By then, she was often confused, but that didn't stop Gordon Brown asking her to Downing Street in 2007.
Thatcher, can we do a pic on the doorstep, please? Prime Minister.
This was supposedly a private meeting, but the media were there in force as Lady Thatcher, dressed in striking pink, arrived in Downing Street. Gordon Brown greeted her with a handshake.
It may have been a kindness, as she was so attached to the place, but others saw it as a political ploy by Brown to demonstrate an uncharacteristically inclusive style of leadership. The following year, Carol upset some of her mother's friends by going public about her mother's dementia in a new book.
I thought, if I leave it out, it will be an omission. I think it must be incredibly frustrating for her. This was someone who had a memory like a website. She could bounce up in Prime Minister's Question Time when she was Prime Minister, quote, reams and reams of statistics without even a note. So I think it must be very frustrating for her. But, you know, when you're in something, you cope and you get on with it.
That book was one of the sources for the film The Iron Lady, which portrayed her lonely decline into senility. Her friends were appalled by this, which they regarded as untrue and tasteless, though it did accurately reflect her sense of banishment. The Conservative backbencher Connor Burns visited her every week right up until last weekend. He says she was still fascinated by politics and her political instincts were very much intact.
She continued to attend dinners and receptions and so on until very, very recently. She still had very firm views, and the thing I always say about her, although impaired by memory and frustrated by increased frailty, her instincts were in full working order right to the end. If you told her something that had happened, you would get an authentic Thatcher response. After the 2010 election, she expressed an interest in meeting some of the new parliamentary party, and she was so touched that almost all of those that we met at these little receptions had come into politics because of her. And one colleague said to her, of course, we're in coalition with the Liberal Democrats now. And she raised her index finger at him and said, I am not in coalition with the Liberal Democrats.
Even though she was apparently up-to-date enough to express a view on the coalition, Connor Burns says diplomatically she never expressed an opinion on David Cameron, as by the time he became Prime Minister, she was not following daily events. He did, of course, invite her to Downing Street after he was elected, but during the election, Cameron deliberately distanced himself from her kind of ideological conservatism, presenting himself as the leader with a post-Thatcherite vision. Detoxification meant shedding the old nasty party image, which for some around him meant moving further away from Thatcherism. Like all her successors, he struggled to avoid being defined by her. His big society was a direct rebuttal of her often misquoted remark that there was no such thing as society. It was meant to stretch out to voters beyond the Tory bedrock. Thatcher's own great political achievement had been to widen the Tory party's electoral base by appealing to skilled working-class voters. But she had done it not by softening the party's message and being more consensual, but by distilling its appeal and following her convictions regardless of short-term unpopularity. Connor Burns remembers his last meeting with her only last Sunday.
Instincts in full working order. Fascinated by what was going on. Talked about the opinion polls and the fact that we were 9% behind, and she asked me when the next election was, and I said it wasn't for a couple of years, and she expressed the view that 9% behind wasn't far enough behind at this point in the cycle. I certainly didn't expect that would be the last time I would have seen her.
To the end, he says, she remained true to her instincts.
She wanted the Conservative Party to succeed, and she wanted us to win the next election outright. What she was all her life, and certainly was till her death, was a tribal Conservative.
The Conservative tribe owes a huge debt to her, but most of the 23 years since she was forced to step down were extremely painful ones, both for herself and the party. She didn't make life easy for her successors, but as she saw it, it was her duty to protect her legacy. Consensual politics were not for her in office or retirement.